There was a man named Gerald who worked the counter at a RadioShack in Dayton, Ohio for 19 years. He knew which capacitor you needed before you finished describing the problem. He knew that the kid who came in every Saturday was building a shortwave receiver, and he saved the good surplus components in a box under the counter with that kid's name on it. He knew that the retired electrician who smelled like pipe tobacco needed the RG8 Cokes, not the RG58, and he knew why. When you walked into Gerald's store, you left knowing something you didn't know when you arrived. That was the product, not the parts, the knowing. Gerald's store closed in 2014. By then, the company had already forgotten what Gerald was for. The story of RadioShack is not a story about a retailer that lost to the internet, or a chain that couldn't compete with Best Buy, or a brand that failed to adapt to a changing market. Those are the headlines. The real story is about what happens when a company built on a single feeling, the feeling of capability, decides that feeling is too small to scale. It is about the precise moment a store stopped making people more capable and started making them feel watched, followed, and sold to. And it is about the millions of Americans who noticed the change immediately, said nothing, and never came back. The building that started everything was not impressive. A basement on Brattle Street in Boston, 1921. Two brothers named Theodore and Milton Deutschman rented the space and filled it with the things that the serious radio men of that era needed. Vacuum tubes, resistors, wire, coils, crystal sets, soldering equipment. The name came from shipboard radio culture, where the RadioShack was the nerve center of any vessel at sea. The place where signals were sent and received. The place where problems were solved in real time, under pressure, with whatever was on hand. That name was not an accident. It was a mission statement. For the first 4 decades, RadioShack served a specific kind of American. Not a wealthy one, not a credentialed one, a curious one. An amateur radio operator who needed a hard-to-find transformer. A high school kid who wanted to build an intercom between his bedroom and the garage. A television repairman stocking up on tubes before the weekend rush. These were people who believed, without anyone having to tell them, that they had the right to open the machines in their homes and understand what was happening inside. RadioShack was the store that agreed with them. It stocked what they needed and employed people who could explain why. By the early 1960s, the chain had grown to a handful of stores and a mail-order catalog that reached across the country. The catalog was not a price list. It was an education. You could spend an evening with it and come away understanding the difference between a ceramic and an electrolytic capacitor, or why impedance matching mattered in an audio circuit, or how to build a simple AM receiver from scratch using parts on page 47. The catalog asked something of you. It assumed you were capable of more than you currently knew. That assumption was the entire relationship. In 1963, a Texas businessman named Charles Tandy bought the struggling chain for $300,000. He saw something that the previous owners had not fully understood. The feeling of capability was not a niche. It was something that millions of ordinary Americans wanted, and almost nobody was selling them. Tandy scaled the model. He opened stores in strip malls and suburban shopping centers across the country, each one promising the same thing the Boston basement had promised 40 years earlier. That you could walk in, not knowing how something worked, and walk out knowing. By the mid-1970s, there were more than 5,000 RadioShack locations in the United States. Almost every American lived within a few miles of one. Then, in the summer of 1977, a product arrived that seemed to confirm everything Tandy believed about the company's future. The TRS-80 was one of the first home computers an ordinary American could walk into a store and buy that same afternoon. It cost $599, which was a significant sum, roughly $2,800 in today's money, but it was a fraction of what any comparable machine had cost the year before. 10,000 units sold in the first month. lines formed outside stores. Parents brought their children in on weekday evenings to watch the demonstration units run programs. Something in the air shifted. RadioShack was not just a parts store anymore. It was the place where the future was being sold, one cardboard box at a time, to people who had every intention of understanding what was inside it. The following decade was the peak. Walk into a RadioShack in 1983, and the experience was still fundamentally the same as it had been in the Boston basement 60 years earlier. The parts drawers were along the back wall, organized by component type and value. The employee behind the counter had opinions about antennas. The catalog, which came out every year and which serious customers treated like a magazine, offered everything from soldering irons to amateur radio transceivers to burglar alarm kits to remote control aircraft components. The store smelled like a workshop. It felt like a workshop. And the person it was designed for, the builder, the fixer, the tinkerer, the person who wanted to understand how things worked, felt at home in it, the way that person rarely felt at home anywhere else. What happened next did not happen overnight. It happened the way most institutional failures happen, gradually through a series of decisions that each made sense on a spreadsheet, and none of which individually seemed catastrophic. The first was the pivot to consumer electronics in the late 1980s. Cordless phones, clock radios, intercoms, pre-built stereo components. These were profitable. They moved fast. They didn't require a Gerald behind the counter to explain them. And they slowly began to crowd out the parts bins, the project kits, the things that required assembly and effort and knowledge. The back wall got a little shorter every year. The second decision was the cell phone. In the mid-1990s, RadioShack became an authorized dealer for the major carriers. The commission structure was aggressive. A sale on a phone plan paid more than a week's worth of component sales. The economics were not subtle. By 2003, nearly half of all RadioShack revenue was coming from wireless phones and their accessories. The store that had once sold the tools to build a radio was now primarily in the business of selling you a device that made phone calls and asking whether you wanted to add a line for your teenager. The parts bins did not disappear entirely, but they became a corner, a shrinking corner. And everyone who had come in for the parts bins noticed. The third decision was what it did to the people behind the counter. Gerald, and the thousands of people like Gerald, were replaced not immediately, but steadily, by employees whose job was not to know things, but to sell things. The scripts arrived. The attach rate quotas arrived. The requirement to ask every customer for a phone number and zip code at checkout arrived, which many customers found intrusive enough that they stopped shopping there entirely. The unspoken contract between RadioShack and its core customer, you will be treated as someone capable of understanding what you are buying, was quietly voided. Nobody announced it. It just stopped being true. There were 7 chief executives in 9 years. Each one arrived with a plan. None of the plans addressed the actual problem, which was not the store count, or the real estate portfolio, or the debt structure, though all of those became problems in time. The actual problem was that the store had stopped doing the one thing that made it irreplaceable. It had stopped making people feel more capable than when they walked in. In 2009, the company rebranded. For a brief period, the signs came down and new ones went up. The Shack. The logic was that RadioShack was a dated name for a dated brand, and that a shorter, hipper identity might attract younger customers. What actually happened was that the people who had grown up with RadioShack recognized the rebrand immediately for what it was, an admission that the original identity was gone, and the younger customers the company was chasing had no reason to walk into a generic electronics store when they could order anything online and have it delivered the next day. The rebrand lasted a few years before the company quietly went back to the original name, which by then carried the weight of everything that had been lost. Bankruptcy came in February of 2015. More than 1,800 stores closed. The liquidation sales drew crowds of people who walked the aisles with a specific expression, not bargain hunters, but mourners. They were buying the last of the parts drawers, taking home the things that had been quietly disappearing for 20 years. A few photographs from those final days show longtime customers standing in empty stores with their hands in their pockets, looking at the bare shelves the way you look at a house after the furniture's gone. What those customers were mourning was not the company. It was the feeling. The feeling that technology was something you could understand, that the machine on your workbench did not have to be a black box, that the right component and 30 minutes of your time could solve the problem rather than the nearest dumpster. That feeling had not actually disappeared from America. The maker movement, the explosion of Arduino and Raspberry Pi projects, the thousands of community workshops and hackerspaces that opened in the 2000s proved that the hunger was still there. What had disappeared was the place on the corner that fed it, the store you could walk into on a Tuesday evening, describe your problem to someone who knew what you were talking about, and walk out with exactly what you needed. In some parts of Latin America, stores still operate under the RadioShack name, stocked with practical electronics and staffed by people who still know what a rectifier diode is and why you might need one. They are not the original thing, but they carry the memory of what the original thing was, which is more than the American version left behind. The parts bins are in antique stores now. The catalogs turn up in estate sales, their covers showing products that no longer exist, their pages describing a world in which a person could reasonably expect to understand and repair every piece of technology in their home. Collectors pay real money for them, not for the specifications, for the feeling that comes off the pages, the feeling that the person reading was being treated as someone serious, someone capable, someone who deserved to know how things worked. Gerald retired in 2015. The building where his store was is a nail salon now. If you had a RadioShack in your town, if you knew the person behind the counter by name, or if that person knew yours, leave it in the comments. The year, the city, what you were building. I want to read it. This is the last frequency. The signal is still out there. You just have to know where to look.